Montana Territory, November 1881. The most experienced builder in Bitterroot Valley stood in front of Silas Brennan's property and called his shelter design a death trap waiting to happen. Brennan wasn't a trained engineer. He wasn't a master carpenter. He was a fur trapper who'd spent 12 winters in the Rockies and understood one simple truth. The Valley's standard cabins were killing people slowly through exhaustion and exposure. What he built looked wrong. It looked weak. And when the town's respected construction foreman, Edmund Carver, saw the half-buried structure emerging from the hillside, he didn't just criticize, he warned. That thing will collapse under snow load. The moisture will rot it from below. And God help you when smoke has nowhere to go. But Silas Brennan had seen something the experts hadn't. He'd watched families burn through cords of wood just to keep a single room above freezing. He'd seen children sleeping in shifts because there wasn't enough heat to go around. He'd helped bury neighbors who'd worked themselves to death hauling fuel. Today, you're going to understand why the worst idea in Bitterroot Valley became the most copied shelter design within 3 years. If you want to see how frontier survival was really done, with real engineering, real numbers, and real results that humbled the experts, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week, I bring you one technique that actually worked when lives depended on it. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and let's bring this lost wisdom back to life. Silas Brennan arrived in Bitterroot Valley in the autumn of 1869, following trap lines that wound through stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. He was 23 years old, lean from trail living, and he'd already survived 5 Montana winters in higher elevations. What struck him about the valley settlement wasn't the cold. He expected that. It was the waste. Standard cabins in the region followed a predictable pattern. Single-story log structures, above-ground construction with minimal foundation, a stone fireplace on one gable end, and wooden floors elevated 6 to 12 inches off the earth on rough-cut joists. The logic seemed sound. Elevation prevented ground moisture. Thick log walls blocked wind. A generous firebox provided heat. But the system failed in ways that compounded through the season. First, the wind. Valley storms didn't just blow, they scoured. Air infiltrated through every gap between logs, through the floorboards, around door frames. Families stuffed rags and moss into cracks, but by January, those seals had dried and shrunk. Cold air poured in from below, creating a permanent draft that pulled heat straight up and out through the roof. Second, the wood consumption. A standard cabin required 4 to 6 cords of seasoned firewood per winter. Hauling, splitting, and stacking that volume consumed weeks of labor. Worse, the wood burned fast. Families fed their fires every 2 to 3 hours through the night, where they woke to frozen water buckets and frost inside the windows. Third, the cold floor problem. No matter how much wood you burned, the floor stayed cold. Children couldn't play on it. Sleeping on it was dangerous. Families built sleeping lofts near the ceiling where heat pooled, but that meant living in a cramped space while the rest of the cabin went unused. Silas watched this pattern repeat across dozens of homesteads. The settlers weren't lazy. They weren't ignorant. They were following accepted practice, and it was grinding them down. In the winter of 1880, Silas made his decision. He owned a small parcel on the eastern slope of the valley, where a natural hillside offered something most builders ignored: thermal mass and wind protection built by the land itself. He began digging. His plan violated every local standard. Instead of building up, he built in. He excavated 8 feet into the hillside, creating a chamber that would sit partially underground. The rear wall and both side walls would be earth-backed. Only the front wall would face open air, and he planned to recess it 4 feet behind a protective berm. He designed the entrance as a covered trench, a tunnel approach that descended gradually, keeping wind from blasting directly into the living space. Inside, he planned a central masonry heater, not a traditional fireplace. The heater would incorporate a long flue path through stacked stone, absorbing heat before it escaped. The floor would sit on compacted earth, with a layer of river stone for drainage and thermal coupling. No elevated joists. No air gap. Just direct contact with the ground's stable temperature. When word spread, the reaction was immediate. "You're building a grave," one neighbor said flatly. First hard snow will bury you alive. Edmund Carver, the valley's most respected builder, was less polite. He constructed over 40 cabins in the region, and he knew his business. When he inspected Silas's excavation, he saw disaster. Moisture will seep through those earth walls and rot everything you own. Your firewood will mold. Your bedding will mildew. You'll breathe damp air all winter and wake up with lung fever. He pointed at the narrow entrance. In that tunnel, one spark from your fire, and smoke will trap you underground with no way out. This isn't clever, Brennan. It's suicidal. Silas didn't argue. He kept digging. The design that Edmund Carver condemned was actually a calculated response to specific thermal failures. Silas Brennan's shelter measured 16 feet wide by 24 feet deep, with an interior ceiling height of 7 feet at the center, sloping to 6 feet at the rear. The 8-foot excavation put the floor 3 feet below the frost line, where soil temperature held stable around 45 degrees Fahrenheit to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even when surface air dropped below zero. The rear and side walls weren't just earth. They were insulated earth. Silas lined them with a double layer of split logs, creating an air gap of 3 inches between the wood and the soil. He packed that gap with dry pine needles and moss, changing the insulation annually. The logs themselves were positioned vertically, not horizontally, and seated into a foundation trench filled with river stone for drainage. The front wall was the only fully exposed surface, and he built it like a fortress. 2 layers of chinked logs with a 4-inch gap filled with clay and dry grass. The wall sat recessed behind an earth berm that rose 5 feet high, extending 8 feet forward from structure. This berm acted as a windbreak and a thermal buffer, forcing cold air to rise and pass over the shelter rather than striking it directly. The entrance trench descended at a 12-degree angle over a distance of 10 feet. The trench walls were reinforced with stacked stone, and the roof was a series of split logs covered with sod. The design was deliberately indirect. It prevented wind from blowing straight into the living space, and it created a cold trap where dense air would settle before reaching the door. Inside, the masonry heater was the centerpiece. Silas built it from river stone and clay mortar, positioning it dead center in the room. The firebox was small, just 14 inches wide and 18 inches deep, but the flue path was long. Instead of venting straight up, the smoke traveled horizontally through a series of internal channels within the stone mass, making 3 complete passes before exiting through a chimney that ran up through the front berm. The principle was heat storage, not immediate radiation. A small, hot fire would heat the stone mass over the course of 2 to 3 hours. That mass, weighing roughly 4,200 pounds, would radiate stored heat for the next 12 to 18 hours. The system required less wood, burned more completely, and maintained a steadier temperature. The floor was compacted earth covered with a 6-inch layer of river stone, then a final surface of split logs laid tight. No air gap, no joists. The floor was thermally coupled to the ground, which meant it wouldn't freeze, and it would stay warmer than any elevated floor exposed to underneath drafts. Ventilation was passive. A secondary stone chimney, separate from the heater flue, ran from the ceiling down through the front berm and exited at ground level outside. Warm, moist air would rise and escape naturally, while fresh air entered through controlled gaps around the door frame. This is what Edmund Carver saw and hated. The earth contact, he argued, would wick moisture into the structure. You're sitting in a damp hole, he said. Stones sweat. Soil holds water. You'll be living in a cellar that never dries. The small firebox seemed inadequate. How do you expect to heat 24 feet of space with a firebox that size? You'll freeze before you can get that stone mass warm. And when it does heat up, you'll roast yourself out. The buried design looked like a trap. One roof collapse, one entrance blockage, and you're done. And what happens when spring melt sends water pouring down that hillside? You'll drown in your own shelter. The ventilation system struck him as wishful thinking. Passive vents don't work when there's no temperature difference. You'll suffocate in your own smoke. And the final insult, it looked like poverty. Above-ground cabins were a mark of settlement, civilization, permanence. A half-buried structure looked like something transient people built when they couldn't afford real lumber. "This isn't a homestead," Carver told him. "It's a burrow, and anyone who follows your example will regret it by February." Silas finished the roof, a shallow pitch covered with 2 feet of sod, and moved in on November 8th, 1881. The valley waited for him to fail. Edmund Carver wasn't just dismissive, he was vocal. At the valley's general store, where men gathered on Saturdays to trade goods and gossip, Carver made his position clear. He'd built structures that had survived 15 winters. He'd worked with stone, timber, and earth in conditions that broke weaker men. And he knew bad construction when he saw it. "Brennan's gone and buried himself alive," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "I give him until January before he's knocking on someone's door begging for a real roof." He wasn't wrong to be concerned. Unconventional designs had failed before. 2 winters prior, a homesteader named Gideon Marsh had tried to save on lumber by building a sod roof with insufficient pitch. By March, the weight had bowed his ridge beam, and by April, the whole structure had sagged into itself. Marsh survived, but he lost a season's worth of supplies and had to rebuild from scratch. Carver saw Silas's shelter as a variation of the same mistake: good intentions, bad execution. "The man's gambling with his life over a theory," Carver continued. "And the worst part is, some fool will see it and think it's smart. Then we'll have half the valley digging holes in hillsides, and I'll be the one pulling bodies out come spring." Other voices joined in. Jacob Talmadge, who ran a sawmill at the valley's northern edge, questioned the economics. "Even if it works, and I doubt it will, what's he saving? The cost of lumber? The man spent 3 weeks digging. That's labor he could have spent hunting, trapping, putting up food. Time is money, and he wasted it." Nathan Howell, a stonemason who'd worked on half the chimneys in the region, scoffed at the masonry heater design. "I've seen Russian stoves, finished contraptions, all sorts of clever ideas. They work fine when you've got an expert tending them. But Brennan's not a mason. That flue path he built, it'll clog with creosote in a month. And when it does, he'll either freeze or burn the place down trying to clear it." The criticism wasn't just technical, it was social. Margaret Carver, Edmund's wife, spoke for many of the valley's women when she visited the Brennan site with a basket of preserves, a gesture of neighborly concern. She took one look at the entrance trench and the low-slung profile and shook her head. "Silas, this isn't a home. It's a hiding place. What woman would want to raise children here? It's dark. It's low. It feels like you're living in shame." She wasn't cruel, just honest. In a region where every structure was a statement of intent. "I'm staying, I'm building, I'm making a life," Silas's shelter looked like retreat. Even sympathetic voices carried doubt. Paul Driscoll, a fellow trapper who respected Silas's backcountry skills, visited in late November. He admired the workmanship, the attention to drainage, the clever use of the hillside. But he couldn't shake his concerns. "Silas, I believe you know cold. I believe you know survival. But this," he gestured at the earth-backed walls, the sod roof. "This is different than a winter camp. You're planning to live here for months. What if you're wrong? What if the moisture gets you? What if the heating system doesn't scale?" Silas's response was the same to everyone: wait. He didn't defend the design with arguments. He didn't cite principles or theory. He just asked people to watch what happened when the cold came in earnest. By mid-December, the valley had moved on. Silas Brennan's shelter was a curiosity, a cautionary tale in progress, and most people expected a quiet admission of failure once the January freeze set in. Then the winter of 1881 to 1882 turned brutal. The cold arrived on December 18th with a clarity that was almost beautiful. The sky went pale blue, cloudless, and the temperature dropped like a stone. By evening, it was 8 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, -4 degrees Fahrenheit. By dawn on the 19th, thermometers across the valley read -18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was rising. This wasn't unusual. Montana winters regularly dipped below zero. What made this different was the duration and the wind. The cold held. December 20th, -22 degrees Fahrenheit. December 21st, minus 26 degrees Fahrenheit with gusts that bent trees and stripped heat from anything exposed. Families burned through their daily firewood allotment by mid-afternoon and started rationing. By Christmas, the valley was in crisis mode. Standard cabins, built above ground, elevated on joists, with stone fireplaces venting up a single flue, were struggling. Fires had to be fed every 90 minutes to maintain interior temperatures above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Families slept in shifts. One person would stay awake to tend the fire while others huddled under layers of wool and hide, trying to conserve body heat. Children stopped playing. The cold floor made it dangerous to sit or lie down for long. Families stacked hay bales inside their cabins and used them as insulated seating, but the effect was marginal. Worse, the wood supply was running out faster than expected. Families who'd calculated 4 cords for the season were burning through 6. Men went out in minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit weather to fell frozen trees, haul logs on sleds, and split wood with axes that rang like bells in the cold. Edmund Carver's own cabin, well-built and generously stocked, was holding steady, but even he was burning wood at a rate that concerned him. His family kept the fire roaring day and night, and the interior temperature hovered around 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Livable, but not comfortable. Across the valley, people started wondering, how is Silas Brennan doing? Paul Driscoll made the trip on December 27th. The snow was knee-deep, the wind was relentless, and he half expected to find Brennan hauling gear to a neighbor's cabin, ready to admit defeat. What he found stopped him cold. Smoke was rising from the chimney, thin, steady smoke. Not the thick black plume of a roaring fire, but the pale wisp of a well-burning, efficient flame. Driscoll descended the entrance trench, knocked, and stepped inside. The temperature hit him immediately. It wasn't blazing. It wasn't oppressive. It was steady, a warmth that filled the space evenly from floor to ceiling without the scorching blast near the firebox that every standard cabin suffered. Silas was sitting at a rough-hewn table, mending a trap line. He was in a wool shirt, no coat. His face wasn't flushed from heat or pale from cold. He looked comfortable. "What's the temperature in here?" Driscoll asked. Silas glanced at a mercury thermometer hanging on the wall. 68 degrees. Hasn't dropped below 65 in 3 days. Driscoll walked to the masonry heater. He placed his hand on the stone surface. It was warm, not burning, but radiating a gentle, continuous heat. The firebox was barely glowing. A small bed of coals, maybe 8 inches across, sat on a thin layer of ash. "When did you last feed it?" 4 hours ago. "I'll add another log around supper time." Driscoll did the math in his head. In his own cabin, a fire that small would die in 90 minutes and leave the place freezing within 3 hours. Silas was maintaining 68 degrees Fahrenheit on a fraction of the fuel. "How much wood are you burning per day?" Silas walked to the corner where his firewood was stacked. He'd marked the wall to track consumption. "About a quarter cord per week. Maybe less." Driscoll stared. A quarter cord per week meant 1 cord per month. Across a 5-month winter, that was 5 cords total, and Silas was using less than he'd estimated. Standard cabins were burning 6 cords in the same period and still struggling to stay warm. "The floor," Driscoll said, looking down. He crouched and placed his palm on the split log surface. It was cool but not cold. Certainly not frozen. "Ow!" "Ground coupling," Silas said. "The earth below the frost line sits at 48, maybe 50 degrees year-round. The floor draws from that. It'll never freeze, and it'll never spike hot. It's stable." Driscoll stood and walked the perimeter. The walls felt dry. No condensation. No frost forming on the interior logs. The air smelled clean. No smoke, no mustiness. "What about moisture?" "Everyone said you'd be soaked." Silas pointed up. "Ventilation chimney. Warm air rises, exits through the top. Fresh air comes in through the door gap. It cycles naturally. In the earth walls, people think earth means damp, but that's only if you let water in. I drained the site before I built. There's a gravel bed below the floor. Water doesn't pool." Driscoll left that afternoon and returned to the valley with a story that didn't make sense to people until they saw it themselves. And if you think the valley accepted this quietly, you haven't been paying attention. Stay with me, because what happened next humbled the most experienced builder in the region and changed how people thought about survival. Drop a like if you're hooked, and comment below, what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Let me know where you're watching from. Paul Driscoll's account spread through the valley like wildfire, but it met resistance. He's exaggerating, some said. There's no way Brennan's burning a quarter of the wood we are and staying warmer. It's a fluke, others argued. Maybe his hillside placement catches less wind. Maybe he's just tougher than most. Edmund Carver didn't dismiss the report, but he didn't accept it either. He needed to see for himself. On January 3rd, 1882, with the temperature at minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit and the valley locked in its coldest stretch in 15 years, Carver made the journey to Brennan's shelter. He brought Nathan Howell, the stonemason, and Jacob Talmadge from the sawmill. 3 men who knew construction, who understood materials and physics, who wouldn't be fooled by theater. They descended the entrance trench and stepped inside. The first thing Carver noticed was the silence. In his own cabin, the fire roared constantly, with crackling air rushing up the flue, wind howling outside, and finding every gap in the structure. Here, the sound was muted. The fire whispered. The wind was a distant murmur, blocked by earth and stone. The second thing was the air quality. Carver had expected stuffiness, smoke, the damp smell of earth. Instead, the air felt clean, slightly dry even, with just the faint scent of burning pine. The third thing, the thing that made him walk to the thermometer and check it twice, was the temperature. 70 degrees. Dead center. When did you last add wood? Carver asked, his voice flat. Silas was sitting near the table, stitching a leather boot. About 5 hours ago. I'll feed it again before bed. Carver walked to the masonry heater and placed both hands on the stone mass. The surface temperature was warm. He estimated around 120 degrees Fahrenheit to 140 degrees Fahrenheit based on how long he could comfortably keep his palms pressed against it. The heat radiated evenly across the entire structure. There were no cold spots, no sections that had lost their charge. Nathan Howell knelt by the firebox and peered inside. A bed of glowing coals, maybe 6 inches deep, sat on a layer of fine ash. No flames, no active combustion, just slow, sustained burn. This shouldn't work, Howell said quietly. The mass to firebox ratio is too high. You need to burn hot for hours just to bring this stone up to temperature, and then it would cool too fast to be useful. It takes 3 hours to charge fully, Silas said. Small splits, dry wood, good draft. The stone absorbs the heat, and then it gives it back over 12 to 16 hours, depending on outside temperature. I fire it twice a day, morning and evening. Jacob Talmadge was examining the walls. He ran his hand along the interior logs, checking for moisture, for condensation, for any sign of rot. The wood was dry. He pressed his palm against the wall and felt a faint coolness, but no dampness. How is this dry? He asked. You've got 8 feet of earth behind this wall. Soil holds moisture. Frost dries it inward. This should be weeping. Silas walked over and tapped the wall. 3-inch air gap between the logs and the earth, insulated with dry moss and pine needles. The gap breaks the thermal bridge, and the insulation wicks any moisture before it reaches the wood. Plus, the ventilation system pulls humid air out before it condenses. Carver moved to the floor. He crouched, removed his glove, and placed his bare hand on the split logs. The surface was cool, around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, he guessed, but not cold. Certainly not frozen. In his own cabin, the floor this time of year was 35 degrees Fahrenheit to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that standing on it barefoot for more than a minute would numb your feet. Ground coupling, Silas said, anticipating the question. The earth below the frost line sits at 48 degrees. The floor stays close to that. It'll never freeze, and it'll never get hot. It's just stable. Carver stood. He looked at Howell, then at Talmadge. The 3 men didn't speak, but the exchange was clear. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't luck. This was a system that worked, and it worked better than what they'd been building for years. How much wood have you burned since December 1st? Carver asked. Silas walked to his woodpile and pointed to the marks on the wall. Just under 3 cords. I'll finish the winter on 5, maybe 5.5. Carver did the math. His own cabin had burned through 4.5 cords since December 1st, and it was only early January. At this rate, he'd need 8 cords to make it to April, and his family was still cold half the time. 5 cords, Carver repeated, and you're maintaining 70 degrees. Most days between 65 and 70, Silas said. It drops to 62 if I let the fire go out completely, but the mass holds enough heat that it takes 8 hours to fall that far. I've never seen it go below 60. The room was quiet. Outside, the wind picked up and a gust rattled snow against the front berm. Inside, the temperature didn't shift. The warmth stayed even, radiating from the stone mass, rising gently through the space, cycling naturally through the ventilation chimney. Carver walked to the entrance, paused, and turned back. I was wrong, he said. This isn't a death trap. It's the smartest structure in the valley. By late January, word had spread to every corner of Bitterroot. Families started visiting Silas's shelter, not to criticize, but to learn. Men took measurements. They sketched the masonry heater design. They asked about drainage, about insulation, about flue path and ventilation. Nathan Howell, the stonemason who'd predicted creosote failure, returned 3 times to study the heater. He brought a notebook and documented the internal channel layout, the firebox dimensions, the stone mass calculations. By February, he was offering to build similar systems for anyone willing to pay. Edmund Carver didn't just recant. He rebuilt. In the spring of 1882, he excavated a section of his own property and constructed a partial earth-sheltered addition to his cabin, incorporating the ground coupling principle and a smaller masonry heater. His wood consumption the following winter dropped by 40%. Jacob Talmadge, the sawmill owner, saw a business opportunity. He started milling smaller dimensional lumber specifically for earth-sheltered construction, timber for retaining walls, for roof beams that could handle sod loads, for door frames designed for recessed entrances. By the winter of 1883 to 1884, 17 cabins within a 50-mile radius had incorporated some version of Silas Brennan's design. Not all of them went full earth-sheltered. Some built partial berms, others added masonry heaters to existing structures, a few dug entrance trenches to block wind. But the principle had taken root. Work with the ground, not against it. Store heat, don't just generate it. Control airflow, don't fight it. The valley had learned what Silas Brennan knew from the beginning, that survival isn't about following tradition. It's about understanding the problem and building the solution that actually works. Silas Brennan lived in his earth-sheltered home for 23 years. He expanded it twice, adding a second room in 1886 and a root cellar access through an interior hatch in 1891. He married in 1885, raised 2 children in that hillside structure, and never spent more than 6 cords of wood in a single winter. When he died in 1904, his shelter was still standing, still warm, still dry. His son continued living there until 1920, when he relocated to Missoula for work. The structure was eventually abandoned, and by the 1950s, it had collapsed back into the hillside, but its influence never disappeared. The masonry heater design that Nathan Howell documented became a regional standard. Variations of it appeared in cabins across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. Some called them Bitterroot heaters. Others called them Brennan stoves. The principle remained the same. Maximize thermal mass, extend flue path, burn small and hot, radiate slow and long. The ground coupling technique, dismissed as dangerous and damp in 1881, became common practice for root cellars, cold storage, and even partial foundation designs. Builders realized that stable ground temperature wasn't a liability. It was a resource. And the broader lesson, the one that Edmund Carver admitted in his own journals years later, was this: expertise without humility is just arrogance wearing a tool belt. Carver had built 40 cabins before he met Silas Brennan. He knew logs, stone, and timber. He understood joinery, drainage, and load-bearing. But he didn't know everything. And his refusal to consider an unconventional solution almost cost him the chance to learn something that would define his later career. Because here's the truth that history keeps teaching and we keep forgetting. The best solutions don't always look impressive. They don't announce themselves. They don't win approval from committees or get praised by authorities. They just work. Silas Brennan didn't build his shelter to prove a point. He built it to survive. And when survival is the standard, aesthetics don't matter. Tradition doesn't matter. What matters is whether you wake up warm, whether your children can play on the floor, whether you can make it through winter without burning yourself out hauling fuel. The hidden shelter that everyone mocked became the safest place in the valley because it solved the actual problem. Not the problem people thought they had, but the one they were living with every frozen morning. That's the wisdom worth remembering. If this story hit you the way it hit me, if you see the value in learning from people who solved real problems with limited resources and serious consequences, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week, I bring you one technique, one story, one piece of frontier wisdom that actually worked when lives depended on it. And I want to hear from you. What part of Silas Brennan's solution would you apply to your own situation today? Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Let's keep this conversation alive. Educational note. This script is for historical and educational purposes. Any construction project should comply with local building codes and involve consultation with licensed professionals.